Hello, hello, hello. All right. Purpose of this recording is because last Wednesday, when you did the Native Americans and Westward Expansion, we had to rush through a lot of content, and we didn't actually really get to the sources and really explaining the impact of the sources, especially the latter sources for that document. And I still have you actually doing that work and finishing up that work in the Pear Deck. So it'd probably be helpful if I take some time to actually, well, explain and give you some more context and help you out with that. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can actually go ahead and approach those documents. Give me one moment. Gotta just, there we go. Alrighty. So, we are trying in these sources, as you saw with sources A, B, and C, we're trying to see the impact of our actions, the U.S. actions on Native Americans in our attempts to expand and settle into the American West. We've already spent a lot of time on why the United States pushes out west. We need to figure out is how that impacts the people who were already there. So we, in sources A and B, you saw the early part of this history, the 1865 through the early 1880s. You see in the timeline that's in the that you got as part of the readings document. You see that it's actually this complicated history, but it's also very violent, a lot of conflict, and it creates a lot of challenges. We see this with Chief Joseph. We see this with the Sand Creek Massacre, where the U.S. Army is committing atrocities. The U.S. Army is attacking these communities that are just trying to survive and just trying to maintain their way of life. By the 1880s, this is not really working. Um, oh, sorry. I should say we already talked about source C, but it is important. So source C is the railroads, right? The railroads are expanding and are controlling lots of this land, that means it's just completely cutting off and cutting up Native American lands. And then we get to the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act in 1887 is this really just it was done by people who thought they were doing the right thing. And what it ultimately does is actually terrible for Native Americans. And so we need to actually kind of get into that. So first off, when you were looking at sourcing, you would notice that Henry Dawes was a senator from Massachusetts. He's considered a reformer. Some things that we'll actually get into. Um, He's a member of the Friends of the Indian Society. Okay, he's thinking that he's doing the right thing here. Okay, it's also important to notice that it's 1887. Okay, this is after the events like the Sand Creek Massacre, like the Battle of Little Bighorn, where you have this violent conflict. And it's not going well for Native Americans, it's also not going well for the United States. And so Dawes is trying to find another solution. The problem is how he goes about doing that. So let's get into that. First off, the intentions behind the Dawes Act. It again should be noted that Henry Dawes was considered a reformer and a advocate for Native Americans, or at least that's how he thought of himself. Okay? There were lots of these reformers who supported the Dawes Act. They thought this was the right thing to do. It came from this idea if what leads to American success is private ownership and entrepreneurship, and white settlers are getting these economic opportunities, then the Native Americans should be afforded that opportunity. But what people like Henry Dawes and Alice Fletcher, who I'll go into in the next slide, saw was that what was holding Native Americans back was the communal structure of tribes, the communal governments, the communal structure, the effort to work as a collective unit was holding back the entrepreneurship and private economic opportunity that makes America so strong in these folks' mind. Okay. They saw that system of communal ownership as and collective work as denying the freedom to individual economic opportunity and gain. So then the idea is, well, let's actually provide those opportunities by giving private ownership to Native Americans. The problem was the devil's in the details when it comes to how this got applied. So here's one quote by Alice Cunningham Fletcher, who we need to kind of recognize Alice Cunningham Fletcher was a scientist. She was what's called an ethnographer. She went and lived with the Sioux. She lived with actually a couple of different tribes. She is known for being a strong advocate for Native Americans. She's working in the time, the 1870s and 1880s. She was pushing back against these violent moments or the violent clashes with the U.S. Army and trying to say that Americans should be going about this and treating Native Americans better. And so she actually becomes a agent, an Indian Affairs agent who helps divvy up land for the Dawes Act. Okay, she's actually a like pretty what's the word I'm looking for? She is a kind of a pioneer for women's empowerment in government service as well as in academia. Okay, even 40 years before, or not, well, about 30 years before women were given the right to vote, Alice Cunningham Fletcher was an Indian agent, meaning she was a representative of the U.S. government to Native tribes. Okay, and what she says in pushing for the Dawes Act, she says the Indian may now become a free man, free from the thraldom of the tribe, the kind of power, the overarching power of the tribe, free from the domination of the reservation system, free to enter into the body of our citizens. This bill may therefore be considered as the Magna Carta of the Indians of our country. You might remember from AP World, the Magna Carta was this document that fully gives the idea that there's a check on the king's power. It's considered this founding document of Western liberty, right? The Magna Carta is a big influence to the U.S. Constitution. So she's saying that the Dawes Act is going to free the Native American. We'll see. All right, so let me just kind of give you this little visual perspective. Okay, if you're looking and follow along with my large pink cursor here, let's say this is a reservation. This whole grid here is the reservation lands. And what you have a stream that's in it that gives some water, but it's not great. But it does give some, and it helps with farming. And if you irrigate it right, it'll work. And you got this bigger river down here. And that's where you're going to find the best farmlands. The whole reservation is all this, which includes these red areas that are not so great for farming, not so great for grazing, but they're there. Before the Dawes Act, the tribes control the entire thing and work the entire land communally. The resources are pooled together. There is collective work done by the tribal bands. And so even if you happen to live in over here, you're working the lands over here and you're working this. And so you have as much access to all the resources as the people who might live right next to the river. That collective, as opposed to private ownership, that collective responsibility means that everybody's pooling their resources, everybody benefits, and everybody goes through the same things together. Okay, that's what tribal identity and tribal culture is most often pushing. Okay, and this is the system before the Dawes Act. Problem with the Dawes Act, what it does is instead says, no, don't do this collective thing. Don't have everybody own everything. It takes away individual freedom, takes away private ownership, the right to private ownership, which is an American value. Okay, so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to give every family 160 acres. So let's say each one of these squares is 160 acres. Okay, give every family 160 acres, and we're going to plot them out. We're going to allot them that land and it's now that family's. Okay, and then the family will have to divide it up, and we'll see this when we get into the actual text of the document. The family will have to divide it up. based on who's, owning this land and who's actually in the family. And then everything else, well, that's surplus. That's beyond what the tribe needs. And, well, why don't we make some money off of that surplus? Anything that's not included as allotted to the Native American family, well, the reservation doesn't need it anymore. So why don't we just go ahead and sell it to white settlers and to corporations that really, really want it? You're starting to see the problem, right? I think you are. And if we look at the text, we'll go back to this in a second. We look at the text of the Dawes Act. Okay. First off, you should notice as you read through, it says that this is going to be administered by the President of the United States and hereby authorized wherever, in his opinion, any reservation thereof of such Indians is advantageous for agricultural grazing purposes in the United States. That's legalese for the president is going to appoint agents to actually decide how this best gets allotted. And it's for the benefit of the Native Americans and the United States. Okay. This is what's going to take the form of the Office of Indian Affairs. And then it tells what the allotments are going to look like. To each head of family, 1/4 of a section. That ends up being about 160 acres for farmland, 360 acres for if it's grazing. If you're raising cattle or pigs, then they give you a little more land since those animals need to move. Okay. To each single person over 18 years of age. So let's say this is a family with three brothers in it. Those three brothers are going to get 1/8 of the remaining if they're over 18. Let's say two of them are over 18. So they'll get 1/8 the section. So 1/4 of the section is going to go to the head of the family. 1/4 is going to go to those two brothers that are over 18 years old. If there's an orphan that's under 18, they'll get 1/8. So that, it's not the orphan's fault, I suppose, that their parents dead. I don't know, not great. But to each single person under the age of 18, or by 1887, they're going to get 1/16 of a section. Okay. This is getting overly complicated, but what you're noticing is that's not leaving a lot of room for the actual family to plot, since it is a section. And it's at the start, it's 1/4 of a section for the head of the family. By the time this is all done, it's going to be a lot of land that's not allotted. The other thing to notice in this last section of the Dawes Act, okay, after they've after you've signed up, okay, and you're pretty much forced to sign up. After you sign up, well, then are you shall let's see, it says every member of the respective bands or tribes of Indians to whom the allotments have been made. So they've done all they need to, they've signed up for the allotment. They're subject to the laws, both civil and criminal, of the state or territory in which they may reside. Now, that's a big change because the reservation system, as done by the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851, says that the U.S. federal government oversees the reservations. Okay. If you make someone a citizen, right, which is what the section does, after you've signed up for the allotment, you are now a U.S. citizen, but you're also a citizen of the state in which you're now a part of, which means the state government, which didn't have power over you before, now does. Now we remember what's happening after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, with some of these states and how these states are trying to take away powers and take away rights from African Americans and all minorities. And the state governments were empowered to do that because the federal government was taking a step back. The Dawes Act ends up actually enabling them to do that. Okay? Because they're making them now full-fledged citizens of not only the United States, but they're making these Native Americans full-fledged citizens of the states. But then the states get to decide how to treat them. Now, if we look Going back to this, I want to go back to this issue of the excess or surplus lands. Okay. This whole thing right here for the reservation is, let's say it's 100 families on in a tribal land. 100 families that were all before the Dawes Act had all of this. Okay. They're each given 160 acres. Let's say it's 100 families, so that's 16,000 acres. This whole thing is much, much larger than 16,000 acres. The whole reservation was much larger than 16,000 acres. So let's say the Dawes Act commissions these in Native American age, or sorry, these Indian agents. They are U.S. government, so largely white government employees who go sent out to deal with these and try to give out these allotments. What they usually did was they would maybe put a family here and here and here and here and here and then just go all around. And they'd settle the Native Americans along here. Well, that leaves this prime land over here, great for farming, ready access to the best body of water, all that. Well, that's now excess. The tribe only needs this, right? And so we'll sell the rest of this to corporations and to it's called land speculators, basically rich whites who want to own a lot of property. Okay. And if you're a family, a Native American family that used to benefit from the whole collective, you're maybe put on this plot of land right down here, which is in the red, meaning that it's not great for farming. It's actually really bad for farming. Maybe you're put in this yellow section, which is okay for farming, but it's not enough to feed your large family. Or maybe you put in one of this where it's maybe okay for grazing, but it's not really great for what you might need and it might not provide enough. Okay, now we see this play out in two different ways. So over here, let's start over here. This is the Cherokee. This is a map of a Cherokee allotment. And the Cherokee, if you see these red squares, those are where Native American families are put. Now, this grid pattern shows this sheer amount in just this smaller, relatively smaller plot of land or region. You see that all this white, well, that's the stuff that's designated as excess or surplus. And so these lands could be sold to white settlers and to, notably, corporations. Okay. And you see this play out here in this map of the Creek Nation. The Creek Reservation before the Dawes Act is all of this. This is huge. This is basically the middle and eastern section of Oklahoma. Okay. It's a huge part of Oklahoma. After the Dawes Act, the Native American families are allotted the plots of land in the orange. Now, if you'll notice, the majority of this land is not orange. And you see these little squigglies. It's hard to look. If you squint, you can see these little squigglies. Those are rivers and streams. What do we notice? Lots of rivers and stream in the white areas. And some with where they have the orange areas, but not as much as here. And this whole thing used to be the whole reservation. Now only this section. Okay. This is why, and this is a cartoon from 2012. It's not a modern, or it's not contemporary to the events. But this is why, when we see the Dawes Act, we see that it's seen as a kind of act of exploitation, right? Dawes literally eating through Indian lands. We see that in real time, though, at the time with this picture. Several posters immediately after the Dawes Act was passed and the allotments were done. The Dawes Act, there were ads that were sold or that were put out Indian land for sale. They were saying the quiet part out loud. Okay. These are lands that are available. This was not an ad for Native Americans to buy this land. This is an ad for whites to go and buy this land. Get a home of your own, easy payments, perfect title, possession within 30 days. This is exploitation. Okay? So when you're going through in the Pear Deck, you would actually talk about those different impacts. Now, just to kind of a quick thing, and then we're going to talk next about the um, assimilation. Okay. The impact, like in terms of numbers, reservations counted for about 138 million acres of land before the Dawes Act. Okay. That was what Native Americans had access to for grazing, for farming, and for mineral and ground extraction of resources. It's very important when we talk about the discovery of oil as well as mineral resources like gold and silver. The vast majority of this land was given or was seen as surplus and excess because the Native Americans didn't need it, so we'll sell it. 92 million of the 138 was sold away. Okay, to white run corporations and to white settlers. Okay. What was determined as how much was needed was the Indian agents themselves. These are white government agents that are brought in to work with the tribes, but they're not working. They're telling the tribes what to do. Okay. And yes, the Dawes Act does give a pathway to citizenship, but that citizenship comes with some pretty big strings attached. For instance, tribal governments often involved women in government. Well, now that you've made everyone a U.S. citizen, it takes till 1920. So 33 years later is only when women get the right to vote. So that's 33 years of tribal women going from having a lot of power to having no political power. Okay. And not only that, but the states were doing the same things they were doing during Jim Crow to restrict minority rights and voting rights. And that was now subject to the Native American men who were given full citizenship. So you're actually just disenfranchised. You're just taking away political power from anyone who's not white. Okay. What we need to see the Dawes Act as, even though it has the well-intentioned of trying to give this pathways to Americanism and to private enterprise and to ownership of land and to all the things that white settlers have and can build their economic success off of. It's actually a way to exploit. And it's a way to erase native culture, native way of life, and to remove something that was distinct from white culture and try to make it fit in with a system that benefits white citizens. Okay. And we're going to see this clearly played out in how the policies that happen after this, after the Dawes Act, actually take effect. So if we go then to source E in your readings document, what you see, this is a commissioner of Indian Affairs. Okay, that is JDC Atkins. Okay, so that means he is a U.S. government agent. He is white, and he is the U.S. government representative to Native Americans in this particular reservation. This was published in 1885. So one thing that'd be helpful in if you were doing sourcing, for instance, is noticing that this is 2 years before the Dawes Act passes. Okay. What Agent Atkins is saying, it should be industrious grievously impressed upon the Indians that they must abandon their tribal relations and take their lands as a cornerstone of complete success in agriculture, which means self-support, personal independence, and material thrift. Basically, the American way is private ownership. So abandon tribal relations. That's the tribe is gone. Don't do it. And the Indian needs to understand this. They must abandon their tribal relations, give up superstitions. They must forsake their savage habits and learn the arts of civilization. They must learn to labor. They must learn to rear their families as white people do, and to know more of their obligations to government and to society. The Indian must be imbued with the exalting egotism of American civilization so that he will say I instead of we, and this is mine instead of this is ours. Okay? This guy's literally saying the quiet part out loud. Okay? We want to erase the communal and community benefits of tribal culture. That's not the American way. The American way is private entrepreneurship, personal ownership, personal freedoms. So what's happening in the tribes, that's just standing in the way. It's holding them back. Okay? They must abandon these things. Okay? Now, this is before the Dawes Act. This is a guy who's saying this before the Dawes Act. Okay? In his mind, this was the way to help the Native Americans. Okay? So keep that in mind. And then we go to Richard Pratt. Now, with Richard Pratt, I want to stress Richard Pratt was also, like Dawes, a member of the Friends of the Indian Society. Okay. He was actually a Civil War officer who then serves afterwards. He fights in some of the wars in the 1860s and 1870s, and he becomes a superintendent at a prisoner of war camp from those. So these are native warriors who are captured and then put in this camp, in this basically in a military prison. And he is put in charge of it. And he has the bright idea. Well, why don't we actually try and educate? Why don't we provide resources and educate these prisoners? Okay, and for this, he's again considered a reformer. No one else had done this before, and Pratt was given credit, and he justifiably should be, if you're teaching, you know, reading, if you're teaching a lot of the basics that you're getting in education, it's a benefit that people could use for economic gain. He says, well, the problem is he then takes it a step further, and he says, well, why don't we provide this education for all Native Americans? Okay, and this is what the start. He starts the Carlisle School. Carlisle School is the most famous of a lot of schools in the Indian boarding school system. Okay? This is where we see the assimilation, the forced assimilation, and the cultural appropriation. Or sorry, I should actually say disappropriation, removal and erasure of Indian culture by going after the kids. You pressure, force Native families to send their kids to these schools. The Carlisle School was one of those. It was in Pennsylvania, and it was largely Plains tribes, but different ones from all over. Okay, and he says, and again, I want you to keep in mind, Pratt considers himself to be a friend of the Native American. He's trying to help Indian children have a better life. His way of doing that is make them as American as possible. He starts off by saying that that he's calling back to what was said in the 1860s and 1870s. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. It was actually a guy named Philip Sheridan, who was a Union Civil War hero. Okay, who says that, and Pratt is calling back to that, and Pratt doesn't actually agree, but he qualifies it. Right? And this is the line that actually is what Pratt is known for, and why this speech is famous. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Okay? Let that sink in. The statement that often gets put out with Pratt is kill the Indian, save the man. Okay? What he is saying is stop trying to go to war with the Native Americans. It's not working. Stop, having these massacres. Stop having these battles. And let's instead make them American. Under our principles, we have established the public school system where people of all races may be unified in every way and loyal to the government. but we do not gather the people of one nation into schools by themselves, people of another nation into school by themselves. We invite the youth of all peoples into all schools. Again, we have to keep in mind that Pratt's saying this, but this is the start of the segregation system, so it's not really accurate. But Pratt was actually someone who tried to have full integration. Um, okay, so, but he's saying that's not how our system is meant to be fully integrated and educate all our kids in the same things. So let's do that for the Native American. He says, we shall not succeed in Americanizing the Indian unless we take him in exactly the same way. The Indian is not inevitably a savage. He is born a blank, like the rest of us. Left in the surroundings of savagery, he grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. We, left in the surroundings of civilization, grow to possess a civilized language, life, and purpose. Okay, this, by the way, there's a term that you should know. It's what's called paternalism. Okay. This is another word for it is condescending, condescension. Okay. This is, I am so much better, so I should help and teach because I am so knowledgeable. I have the right values. I should teach those who are different from me to be more like me so that they have a better life because I'm so perfect. Okay. So it's called paternalism. You see a lot of it. It's gross, but it is a big part of the rhetoric coming out of even people who are reformers, even people who are progressives at this time. Okay. And then he defends Carlisle, his boarding school. Carlisle fills young Indians with the spirit of loyalty to the Stars and Stripes, and then moves them out into our communities to show by their conduct and ability that the Indian is no different from the white or the colored, and that he has the inalienable right to liberty and opportunity that the white and the Negro have. We cease to teach the Indian that he is less than a man. And when we recognize fully that he is capable in all aspects as we are, and that he only needs the opportunities and privileges we possess to enable him to assert his humanity and manhood. That sounds okay, right? That sounds fine, except if you pair it with this part. The Native Americans' culture is savage and superstitious and not a good way to go. So we need to afford them all the opportunities, which means make them as white as possible. Now let's see that actually play out. Because how it plays out is particularly insidious. So first off, you notice this is actually one of the graduating classes of the Carlisle School. This is the Carlisle School. Also here, you see this is their outside for gym, and you're seeing, a lot of Native American children of different ages. The girls are put in these kind of dresses. The boys are in these almost military uniforms. Pratt himself was a former Army officer. Okay. And then we see how it plays out in these individualized pictures. This is the same man right over here, the same boy. Okay. He's maybe a teenager in this. By the time he's done with the Carlisle School, this is the image. So this is how he went to the school with his culture fully embraced, who he was. This is how he came out. You see that also with these three brothers. You have classes in military band. Okay. Military. You can even imagine that some of these people are coming from tribes that were just at war with the U.S. Army, and now they're wearing military garb and training as military musicians. Okay. You see girls in these light dresses, boys in these almost military uniforms. You see that also playing out here. It's a graduating class. This is erasure. This is assimilation, and it's coerced. It is not something that these families are choosing in and of themselves. It's coerced. They're facing economic pressures. They're facing pressures from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that's pushing to have these kids be sent to these boarding schools in order to erase Indian culture. It's not an accident. They're doing this with children. The aim is to kill the Indian, save the man. In this case, kill the Indian culture in these children so that the Indian culture does not survive. And instead, you have kids that grow up to be almost white. Okay? Cap it all together in what we learned from the whole lesson. After the Civil War, the United States wanted to finish the job, right? We wanted to settle and civilize the West and unite the entire country together. Went through this whole Civil War. We've now dealt with the issues of um, slave states versus free states. So now we just need to unite and make us as economically powerful as possible. Okay. But this really plays out with economic, political, and racial supremacy of the West. The 1860s and 1870s, when we talk specifically about Native Americans' relations, is violent upheaval and conflict. This is where the U.S. Army is actually engaging and fighting these tribes. Okay, that doesn't work. Right? I mean, you force people on these reservations, but you're creating a problem with this violence is going to keep happening. So instead, some reformers, some progressive push for cultural assimilation. Okay, as an intention to erase the Native American culture and identity. The Dawes Act is about land and about farming, but really it's about erasing the unit, the tribe, as a counter to U.S. power, to white power. For Native Americans in the plains and the Southwest, the ultimate result of this forced assimilation is the destabilization of their entire way of life. Okay? The forced removal from economic gains and opportunities, and the expansion of a system of exploitation and neglect that some argue would continue to this day. It certainly continues well after the Dawes Act. Okay, there's a movie that just a couple years ago won a bunch of Academy Awards called Killers of the Flower Moon. It's based on a book, okay, where in Oklahoma, these lands that were allotted to these tribes, well, they were held in trusteeship. Trusteeship meant, well, these natives, they're not schooled enough yet to handle private ownership of this land. So we're going to have white people as the trustees, designated as the trustees for this land. And then they discover oil on a lot of these plots of land. And so then you have complete exploitation of native lands and very little way for Native Americans to actually try and prevent their resources from being stolen and taken from white developers and white trustees who just want to extract as much resources as possible for themselves. Okay. It is the whole history of what we do in the West is an attempt to push aside others for this gain of economic power in the United States. And what we're going to talk about this week, we're going to getting into, is how that economic power plays out in the Gilded Age, and then the kind of progressive and labor movements that try to fight back against those who are economic captains of industry. But what's happening in the West mirrors that. And so that's why it was important that we make sure we got this. All right. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this has helped. Have a lovely weekend, and I will see you on Monday.